Decisions. My name is Kevin Harvey, and I'm a sales engineer here at Decisions. And as you see from your screen, we'll be doing a couple things today, which is exploring data structures and mapping concepts inside of Decisions version 8. So I hope you are ready and have your pencil and paper or notepad available to take some notes. And after our webinar today, it is our goal that you will be able to walk away from this session with a few different concepts or a few different learning objectives under your belt. So the first one, being familiar with different types of data structures and data types available in decisions, be able to distinguish which data structure to use for your specific project, understand the types of features of each data structure, know how to access and properly map the data types, and then finally, understand the options available when mapping in the designers and when to use those. Now, I assume that as we're starting out here today, that everyone here or everyone watching, listening, knows what a data structure is. But if not, let's just briefly discuss what a data structure is. Now, at its simplest form, data structure is just a way to organize and store data, organize and store objects. Inside of decisions, data structures represent and organize business objects for internal logic processes with other designer elements such as flows and rules. So as we go throughout our webinar on today, you'll be able to see exactly what I mean in regards to storing objects inside of flows and rules and capturing those as a part of your process. Now, a part of those data structures are going to be data types. So we have a few different types that we want to discuss here very briefly. We won't get too in depth with this, but I just want to give a brief overview just to catch everyone up on what a data structure and data type is inside of decisions before we get started. So let's briefly go through these. Integral type is, as you see up here in our top left-hand corner here, we have our bytes, we have our characters, we have our integers, that in other platforms and other programs, you may see some variances with the different types of data that you have available inside of decisions, but typically they're pretty much going to go hand in hand, or it'll be easy to kind of recognize the different types as it pertains to other programs as well. We have different floating point types. So the larger your number in this case is going to determine whether it's a single or a double. And of course, with singles and doubles, they are much more friendly with other programs and much more digestible for faster compute inside of decisions as well. But we also do have decimals, and those work very well as well, which is typically what you would see in most projects as well inside of decisions. So it just depends on the use case and how you're planning on using your data, what types to choose. Then down here at the bottom, we have our non-integral types. So of course, the string is going to be our basis for almost all of our data structures. And this represents the alphanumeric text as a series of Unicode characters. And string type is used for all text data manipulations. We have our time span, date time, a Boolean, true or false, and then finally our file data, which is where our bytes come into play as well. Now, before we discuss our data structure types available, I would just wanted to briefly go over some of the features that we're going to see on our next slide. So inside of Decision, you have approximately 12 different types of structures to choose from. And within those different types, you're going to have some features that are going to vary between each one of them. One of them being the option or the feature to be able to save to the database. So when you create the data type, there will be steps that are generated that allows you to easily save, update, or get an item from the database. By saving the data, you can report on this information later on. So not all types inside of Decisions you're going to or are going to natively store or save that information to the database. Some of that information will be just saved in memory and only kept throughout a flow, and then it doesn't persist after the flow. A configuration folder, certain data types enable you to use flows and rules to create actions. So this is going to be a feature on a small subset of our different structures, and these will be customization specific to this composite type, and the actions will appear anywhere the data type appears in the portal. The Entity Framework gives you the ability to easily get access to the data type in a flow. There may be additional fields that are created to track this entity, and this will use cache to enable better management of memory. So going back to the different types of structures that we have available, natively Decisions carries that information or that data throughout the flow, and it's going to live in the memory unless you tell it otherwise. So unless you tell it to save it to a database, a particular structure, then it's only going to be kept in memory as long as that flow is running. If it's not saved to a database while that flow is running, then that information does not persist after, as I mentioned earlier. Folder behavior, this data type is a folder. There are a couple of data types that actually are a folder, which means you store things inside of it. Now, naturally, of course, when you store things inside of it, it's going to be a heavier structure. And then last but not least, we have process tracking. Now, process tracking gives you the transparency into your processes. So there are things like activity panels that will help you to track the state, timestamps, comments, and assignments for these flows. And this is, again, going to apply to just a small subset of our data structures. So if we go on over to our next slide here, we'll be able to see some of these structures that we have available. So if we start over here to the left, a value list. Now this value list, it's going to create an enumerated list of string values that changes regularly. So this is not saved to the database. And typically with value lists, you're going to maybe, I guess a use case for them would be to a drop down list containing all 50 states of the United all 50 states of the United States on a form. So this is just an easy way to declare that list and then use it later on, in this case, as I mentioned, on a form. The next one is a flow structure. Now the flow structure creates an entity that lives solely within a flow that cannot be stored. So as long as that flow is running, as I mentioned on our previous slide, as long as that flow is running, then that information or that data will only be active throughout that flow. Once that flow ends, all of that data doesn't persist thereafter. So a common use case for using a flow structure would be a data repeater, maybe showing data from different tables of data structures. Next up, we're going to have a database structure. Now, the database structure it creates a database table dependent on other components to be manipulated. While there are no limits to the number of rows, more rows will be or will increase query time. So a common use case or example of the use of a database structure would be maybe you have a customer database that you're just trying to maybe add a customer ID, email address, so on and so forth. And then they are formatted into a database table. And as you see here, you can save a database structure. It does save to a database. And you do have the option to have that entity framework and a configuration folder. However, it's not going to, that configuration folder is not going to be active or preset once you create it. You're going to have to tell decisions to enable the configuration folder. Next up, we have a database structure, or at least database structure, and it's going to be very similar to our database structure that we just discussed. However, with the least database structure, it's going to be more so centered towards large data or batch processing. So with the least database structure, it's going to enable you to process more data at the same time and without bogging down the system. So there's going to be very few, unless you're doing batch processing, at least database structure would not be needed. Next up, we have an entity. An entity creates a persistent object and allows the ability to create actions specific to that object. So with the entity, think of it as, or example of it would be creating a person. And that person has different data fields, such as their age, their clothing size, etc. These values can change, but the person or that entity does not. It remains the same. As you see it, this is one that saves to the database structure, and it also, once it's created, has a configuration folder by default. Now we're going to cross over into our blue section over here, and we have our external entity. An external entity is going to work with objects stored externally. So maybe you would like to import a XML or a JSON file with a table of products or product numbers. That's where you will use a external entity. The entity extension is going to tie into what we discussed just a few seconds ago with our entity. Now this is going to create a persistent object that extends a pre-existing type in decisions. So back to our entity with our person example, a person entity with an address extension that can be attributed after that entity is created via an action. So this is just going to be, as the name implies, just a extra extension to an entity that is already created. A folder extension. Folder extension creates a folder that represents an entity. But the neat thing about this is that the folder extension can perform actions. So an example of this would be an insurance policy, folder extension, which actions like renew policy or cancel policy to perform on its object. A flow execution extension is one of the most commonly used type of data structures where you're tracking a process, and this type of structure enables flow data into process data to capture, display, and store in motion. Example of this would be maybe an employee application with data to save and refer to later, such as applicant name, resume PDF, etc. Next, we're going to have a case entity. Now, it's going to function very similar or have some of the same features as our flow execution, in the fact that it is used for tracking and track processing and states. However, this is for unstructured data in a repeatable process with variable outcomes. So maybe your process needs to go from one state and then skip 2 or 3 different states and then go back uh, one additional state. So it's similar to a flow execution, where a flow execution can be used for a defined process where it's going to always flow in the same order. With a case entity structure, you're going to have the ability to, like I mentioned, jump states and hop back and forth. And then last but not least, have a defined data structure. And with defined data structures, it can dictate if it is stored or not stored. It also comes with a configuration folder. As you see, it's for specific advanced use cases to extend an existing data type, maybe for creating a custom DLL. Now, some of the advantages of custom features, as we mentioned. So with folder behavior, some of the advantages would be you can create a custom dashboard on a folder. Maybe you want to display that information on a dashboard inside of decisions. That's also available for those structures where you have folder behavior enabled. We can store documents in a folder and also put assignments in a folder as well. With configuration folder, it's going to be your most common one with adding user actions. So if you want to, you had a process where you maybe want to send an assignment to another user and via a dashboard, and they want to be able to click on a report and go to a review state or send an assignment to another user. This is where that configuration folder will come in handy. But you can also add visibility rules with that configuration folder as well. Then last but not least, we have entity framework, and some of the advantages of that will be entity header table, um, a folder view report. It uses caching, managed in memory, as well as user actions, very similar to the configuration folder. And below that, some of the default properties for a entity under the entity framework are as below as you will see. So it gets much more detailed depending on the type of structure that you choose. You can have a lot of different properties available, very similar to a flow execution as opposed to just a database structure. With a flow execution, you're going to have more properties available, as you see here under entity framework, where you can be able to save that information and be able to recall it later if needed. Now, hopping over into our studio, we want to see what it's like to build a data structure inside of the tool. But before we do so, I wanted to point out this one thing here. When you're creating your projects, you always want to use best practices. So as you see, I've created a folder here at the root. That's our straight data structure and mapping. And then under that, I've created designer folders for our data structures, our flows, and our forms. And how did I do that? I did that by right-clicking on those 3 dots or on that folder. And then I go to create a folder. And when I do that, I'm given 2 options. I can create that folder or I can create a designer project. Now with a folder, you're not going to have these options up here available inside of it. So if I create a folder, I'm not going to have create a flow form or rule available. It's just going to be a folder where I can just store objects inside of it. But if I create a designer project, as I've done over here to the left, then I'll have all of those options available at the top. Now, clicking on Create Data Types and Integration, as you see, this is where we're going to kick that process off of creating our structure. Over here to the left, in version 8, you'll see now that we have a few different options broken up into different fields or different selections. So the first one being user-defined types, and this is where we would create one of those types that we've just gone through. Or we can go to our configuration extension, where we were talking about our entity actions or our folder actions. Create an external structure or external entity where, based on XML or JSON or CSV, we can create a custom structure inside of decisions. Maybe we want to find a database integration or an external service. So all of those options are available. But what we're going to be doing today is just configuring a database structure. And that database structure, as you see, once I click create, is going to take us inside of another window where we can create our type name and then also start defining our data fields. So up here at the top, we want to name our structure. We're going to name the structure customer information. Once I do that, I can just go ahead and start creating my types. So I'm just going to name right here, first name. But as you see, now we have a red or a validation warning. And as you see down here at the bottom right hand corner, we'll see exactly what's going on. In this case, it's just saying we cannot have a space in our name. So if I go back up here to our name here, and if my mouse would act right here for a second, I can go back here to my name and just erase that space. And as you see, that validation goes away. Even in creating your data structures, Decisions is going to be aware of your names and the types that you're creating, just to make sure that everything is, while you're creating it, there are no errors that's going to come up later. Now, while I can continue to go through here, I can set my type. So if this wasn't a string, maybe it was a decimal, I can set it here. However, what I want to do is show you another option. Down here at the bottom right hand corner, we have a quick add option. And what this quick add option allows you to do is add multiple different data member names of the same type. So instead of adding them up there, I'm going to add them right here. So all of my strings, or the rest of my strings, will be email and I'm going to use phone as well as a string. Once I click OK, as you see, instead of going through here and just tabbing over, now this is just a quick way, as the name implies, to add multiple fields. Now last, or second to last, I'm going to add date of birth. And here, I'm going to set it as, I'm going to set it as date instead of date time. Then last but not least, we're going to add a customer identifier. And as you see over here to the right, we do have some additional options available for our fields. We can select if it was a list, if it was null values, or allow null values. Maybe it's a personal or PII information that we want to declare, but we want to hide that or encrypt that data, then we can do so as some of our options over here to the right. But this is going to be it for this particular structure. And so once I click save, Now, once we go back into um, our folder tree or our folder view, list view, now we're going to see that we have a simple data structure available. And if I right click on it, now we have a few different options available as well. I can take actions such as delete it. Maybe I want to go back inside of it and edit it, maybe add some more fields, take some out. Even I can generate a form. So based on those fields that we've entered, I can generate a basic or simple form with those fields available. So what is data mapping? Data mapping refers to the passing of data in and out of a step or form. It is how information can be sent from one part of a process to another. So in order for your information to go from one step of your process, so maybe a form, and go to another step of your process, which may be an email step or maybe a save step for your structure, it would have to be mapped. The most common input mapping options that you have available will be constant, which is just a static value that will not change. So say if you wanted it always to be under a first name, you want it to always be example or David, then that would every time that that particular step runs, that David or that example name would always be output. The most common though is uses select from flow, which is going to allow you to select data as an input from data in the flow that has already been generated. So say if you have information coming from a database and you want to call that information inside of your form or inside of a rule, then you're going to select that information from your flow and input it into that particular step. A null is just a placeholder corresponding to nothing because zero still represents a value. So if you don't want, again, that you just want it to be zero, you don't want it to have any sort of information pulled inside of that particular step or that data type, then you would choose null. Ignore, input not needed at this time. So it just, from a perspective of running the flow, it just bypasses that particular field and it keeps going. Merge HTML. This will concatenate several strings and variable with rich text into an HTML string. So this is one way to pass out or to create a um, custom message that can be used later on with a requirement that it needs to be an HTML string. Merge plain text is just a way to concatenate strings and variable into a plain text string. So instead of HTML, now it's just a plain text. And then finally, a run converter flow allows the user to run a flow that can take in data and output completely different type of data that the step needs. So let's say you have a date that is in the string format, but you wanted to convert it to a date or a date time. Then you can choose to convert that string into a date or a date time format. And to dive just a little bit deeper into converter flows allow you to convert data, as I mentioned, of one data type to another. They can also be helpful in cleaning up data, so it can be handled more elegantly in the process or displayed exactly how you want. They are available for both input and output mapping. So not only can you run that data through a converter before it is input inside of the flow or as it's being input inside of the flow, we can also do that as it's going out of that particular step as well. And then you have two options, which is to run the converter which is just going to execute a converter that you've created, and then the converter will display a list of existing options to pick from. Now, common output mapping types. So coming out of your steps, you're going to have a few different options. The most common one is going to be rename, which we'll get to in a second. But first, we have change value. So let's say you're already running your flow and you would like to change that particular data that has already been saved or in memory inside of your flow, or even on a inside of a database. Maybe you want to change that value. Maybe that value is 100 and you want to change it to 125. Then you would use that change value option on the output to change that value. Rename just allows you to change the name of a variable that is output. Reference reruns the step to get the value rather than storing the value in memory. So that one, not so commonly used, but it is available for you to use that option on your outputs. Ignore, just like we have on the input, on the output. We don't care about this being output. It will not pass data out of the step into the flow. And then finally, pass through. So with pass through, you can maintain name and passes, and it passes through the step. For a form, this is the data name you set on the form control. For a step, this is the default output name, such as on an add step, it would be add1 underscore output. So let's say you don't want to make any changes to it, you just want to pass that information through that particular step, then you would use that option without having to worry about anything being changed for that step or for that particular data type. A few other different options. You have options specific to arrays or lists. So for input, we can build an array of user specified data, or you can join an array, which is you can combine a list of data together. Then finally, for the output mapping, you have an array and you can choose, maybe you only want to output that first item in the list, or maybe the last item that is available as an option. And then options specific to composite structures. On input mapping, you have the option to build data. So this is going to expose the properties of an object and allow you to map the input to those individual fields. So let's say you have a structure that you want to map specific information to from a form. You would use that build data option and then be able to map each property from that form to that structure. And then for output mapping, you can expose the properties, which gives properties of the output as an option. So very similar. And then options specific to date time types. On the input mapping, so let's say you only need the date, you don't need the time. You have the option on the input to just set it as a constant date. So if it's like today's June 3rd, 2022. So if you only want it to be, you want that to be that constant date of June 3rd, 2022, then that's what option you would choose. Now, if you want it to be that same date and then a time as well, you can use that constant date and time. Current date and time, this is very similar. I used it June 3rd as options, but maybe you want it to be that is this day specifically. You can use the current date. Maybe the constant date can be a date in the past or a day in the future as well. Then finally, we can compute a date. So we can specify a start date and time. and create an offset. So maybe you want it to be a certain amount of days in the future or a certain amount of days in the past. Now that we have some knowledge under our belts in regards to mapping, what I'd like to do is go back inside of the studio and take a look at what it's like to use that data now, use that structure, and use it inside of a flow. So what we can do is go to our flows folder tree now, and before we actually create that flow, let's take a look at a form that we created. So if I go inside of my form, as you see here, I just have some simple fields or a simple form with those fields from our data structure, such as our first name, last name, date of birth, phone, and email address. And this is what we're going to use inside of our flow. I just already created this form for us just to save some time. And let me go back inside of our flows folder now. And if I go up here to the top, I want to create a new flow. And we're just going to name this flow our customer flow. And once I click create, it's going to take us inside of our flow designer. Now, hopefully by now, you're already familiar with our flow designer. But just to give a brief overview of it, we have our actions bar up here at the top. Has actions such as save, checkpoint, and undo. Right here in the middle, you always be given a start step and an end step. And right now, these have some red exclamation points on them, and that's because decisions environment is self-validating. So just like when we were creating our data structure and we got that validation warning on that structure when we had that space in there, our flow designer acts in the same way. If we go back and go down here to the bottom left hand corner, we can see exactly what's going on with our steps, which it means just showing our start step is connecting to anything as well as our end step. But once we connect those together, our validations go away. Now what I would like to do is, first of all, we're going to bring that form inside of our flow. And once we have that form, once we drag a form or a rule onto our workflow, we'll always be given an option to pick or create that form or rule. Since we've already created this form, we're just going to choose our pick option. And if we go to our recents now, we can pick our customer info form that's already been created. And once this updates, as you see over here to the right, our inputs is going to be looking for those inputs from the form. Now, we can take this a couple of different ways. We can call that information if we're maybe using a database, calling that information from another part of our flow. We can bring it in and set those inputs on that particular data field. And so as you see here, now we have options available that we discussed earlier in our mapping section, or we can set a constant date if this was a date field. We can set our constant date and time, maybe select it from the flow, and other things of that nature. And as you see right here, we also have converter, where we can automatically convert a string to date, as I mentioned earlier as well. But for right now, what we're going to do, since we're going to be inputting these fields in dynamically once we debug it, we're just going to set all of these to ignore. Now here comes our fun part, because now what we want to do now is take that information and decide what we're going to do with it afterwards. So down here in the bottom left hand corner, what we can do now, since we created a database structure earlier, now we can go down here under our user defined types, and now we have access to all of our database structures that have been created, whether it's an external source, XML, whatever that type or that database structure is, we now have access to it. So if I go inside of my database structures and go inside of now our customer information as we created earlier, now I have the ability to drag out some different steps in regards to that structure. I can create the information, delete, edit, get all. So if I already have information stored inside of my database, I can get all of that information and call it inside of the flow. What we're going to do first, since we don't have anything stored on our database or inside of our database, we're going to drag a create step on over. And we want to create, let decisions know that, hey, we're going to start and we're going to create this information here. So as I mentioned earlier, inside of our database structures, as we're creating them inside of the flow, we'll be given some options. So on this structure, now we have options like constant, select from flow, build data. And what we want to do, since this is a composite structure, we want to build data. And then what that data is going to do, or allow us to do, is let's say we wanted to map in that information inside of our structure. Then we can do so. Um, and mapping into from our form. So let's do that. And instead of putting it here, let's go ahead and put it after our form. You can do it either way. Putting it before it would just let decisions know we're going to start that process of creating that information. So it wouldn't be, we won't get an error on the back end saying that there's no information present. So if you want to do a selective update after this particular form or later on in our process, then we already have some information generated inside of that. But coming from our form now, what we can do is now that we've selected that, we can go inside now and say for our date of birth. Now we can go and choose that date of birth. Now what it's asking for is at date time. But as you see right here, we have just date chosen. So let's go back inside of our form now. And let's make that change. So right here now we have our date picker. And better yet, I have a better way of doing that. Let's go back. And what we're going to do is go back to our structure. And for that, instead of choosing date, we're going to choose date time. And once we save it, we're going to go back inside of our flow. And that's going to give us that option now to pick that date. So now if I go back here now, edit, as you see, now I have the ability to choose now that date that we would like instead of date time. For our email, we're going to just continue to do the same thing. Select from flow. We're going to choose our email address. And so on and so forth. But another way to do this, so I'm doing it this way, where you can go through each one and select it from the folder tree. But there's also another way of doing it. So if I go up here to the top now and go to input mapping, this is some consider a faster way. And it just depends on your preference of how you would like to do it. But this is one way or another way of achieving the same result, which is just going in and dragging and dropping your lines to your particular data field, okay? And you see you have different options available. So if you wanted to, if there was a need for flow data, you can use that flow data as well, or if you needed to connect to a external database, that would be under system constants as well. But make sure once you're doing this, a common thing that some people make the mistake of doing is just hitting that X button. And if you hit the X button, it's going to unfortunately eliminate or not save the changes that you've made. So please make sure you always go down to the bottom and click OK. And once you click OK, that's going to save what you just added to there. And once I do that, as you see, I've mapped all of my fields in now. And what I can do is go now to our debugger. Now, if you're not familiar with it, the debugger is Decision's very own testing environment. You can go in and test your workflows, test your rules, just to make sure everything is functioning properly. So I'm going to enter in my name. I'm going to enter in my last name. And let's say I want to go back and I want to choose my birth year. And I'm just going to do a hypothetical here. I don't want to give my birth date away here, but I'll just say I was born August 10th, 2000, and we're going to enter in phone number. So as I mentioned earlier, we have that mass text box. So this is just a way to make sure that customers are entering or users are entering information in a way that is necessary for that particular box. And then just put Kevin at decisions.com. Once we click done, I'm going to right click on my create data step now. And as you see, now I have my information that has been passed inside of a database and it's been stored, passed inside of this step. First name, last name, email address, phone, date of birth, and my ID. And as you see here, now we just have a entity ID that was generated for this step. So again, this is just a very high-level overview of your data structures and also how to map your data structures as well. I hope this lesson was very helpful for you. Please feel free to check out all of our additional videos on YouTube as well as on our website for version 8 as well as previous versions. And feel free to contact us with any questions. I hope you have a great day.